Thank you for coming out to Irv Seaver tonight to see Sean and Louise and the new R1300 GS Adventure. Sean and Louise do a great job explaining all the features and all the new technology that's in these motorcycles. It's going to be a really great show. Sean, Louise, come on up.
Thank you very much.
Tell us what you know.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you, everybody, for braving the weather.
That's right.
And coming out here tonight.
And Sean's joking about that, but I left Kentucky yesterday morning to come out here, and it was 22 degrees when I left. So I'm actually really enjoying your weather.
Quite
so
pleasant.
Thank you for having this.
You see this?
Oh my God,
yeah,
that's heated gear.
I see
right
heated gear,
there.
which ironically in my travels around the U.S., I haven't seen anybody using heated gear, but here in California, where I would say it's probably about 62 degrees out, it seems apt.
Well, sometimes the heated grips and the heated seats are just not enough.
And the gloves, and the socks, right? It's very, very important. Well, again, thanks everybody. So I think I've shaken hands with all of you, but if I haven't, I'm Sean Thomas. I'm the BMW brand ambassador, and it's my job to sort of understand the ins and outs of the motorcycle and sort of translate it into information that's easy to understand. And I think that this is becoming a lot more important as all motorcycles from all manufacturers become a lot more technologically advanced. And it's not just that they have more tech, it's that the technology is evolving. So we're seeing new generations of technology that even tech that's been around for, like ABS brakes came out in 1986 for motorcycles. And now the ABS system is far more sophisticated than it was then. So it's not enough just to say that a bike has ABS. It's much more important to sort of understand it and the inner workings, what makes it different, what makes it new, what makes it special compared to the old version. And this is a personal passion of mine, and in order to figure that out, I've spent about 20 years getting to know the people that work at BMW on the inside, the designers, the engineers, the marketing people, the management team, and so that I can start picking apart this technology and understanding it in a way that is easy to share with folks like yourselves and with the dealerships, and I travel all over the world doing that sort of stuff. You've probably seen a lot of, if you've watched YouTube, you've seen videos of me on camera discussing technology occasionally, and if you enjoyed what I said, you can thank Louise Powers.
You can thank me for that. And, Sean came from a background of, learning how to ride a motorcycle as a younger person, working in a dealership. So, trying to figure out what to let you know about bikes. I come from a background of learning how to ride a motorbike as an adult, and then having an absolute passion for riding and traveling on these things. And one of the things that I have found so fascinating in the last several years of working with Sean is actually being able to go to Germany and talk to the people who do develop these bikes, the designers and the engineers. And what I learned was that they are just as passionate about riding and traveling on these things as I was. Which honestly, I didn't originally expect. And of course, now it makes a whole lot more sense. So one of the things I love to learn from them is what they love the most about these bikes, so that then I can share that with you guys, so that you understand why they came up with what they did and why they developed it and what they were thinking behind that. Because I know that when I learn it, it's absolutely fascinating. So I love being able to share that with you guys. So whether it's writing scripts so that I can make Sean look good on camera.
It's not enough to just be pretty. You got to sound good too.
That's right. Or coming out here and being able to hang out with you guys, talk to you about what you ride, and then share all the new stuff about these bikes. This is the thing that drives us to do what we do. So we're super excited to be here with you guys tonight.
And in addition to those of you that are here with us in person, we also have YouTube Live joining us. So those of you online that are watching from around the world, thank you very much for joining us. We're happy to have you. And we're going to be answering questions. We're going to talk about the history of the adventure. We're going to talk about the tech. We're going to compare it to the other similar models so you sort of understand the differences. And we're going to dig in deeper into some of the tech and answer your questions. And that includes those of you online. If you have questions along the way, shout them out, write them in the text box, and we'll be made aware of them, and we'll answer those questions too.
That's right, and for those of you who are still showing up, we have a few seats up here, so please come and sit and enjoy. Got more seats up front.
All right, so that being said, let us pose the very first question to you as our trusty viewers. The very first motorcycle that we would probably today call the adventure version of the GS. It wasn't called an adventure at the time, but can anybody here name what the first adventure version of the GS was and the year it was made? Yes, sir.
I don't know the year, but it was Dakar.
It was a Dakar. Interesting.
So if anybody listened to our Ride and Talk podcast that we recorded with Reiner Fings, who was the product manager for the R1300 GS Adventure, we actually asked him this question, and we posed to him what we thought was the first adventure model, and he actually said, yeah, okay, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with your answer.
So what's so interesting about the GS in general is that when BMW developed the GS, they were also more or less developing the adventure riding category. It didn't really exist formally at that point. And with the first BMW GS, the R80, the general feedback that they got from people was that it's a very nice bike, it's very nice and comfortable to ride. It's not an off-road bike. It's too big to ride off-road, which is sort of funny and ironic because if we look at an R80 GS now, they're actually quite small by comparison. But back then, that was considered a really big bike.
Especially to take off-road as well as on-road, take a big heavy bike and ride it off-road in the dirt.
And generally, the formula way back then, is not that long ago, but back then, when you wanted to get a new category up and running, oftentimes you would compete with it. You'd put it in some sort of competition in order to demonstrate to people its value. And of course, that's easy to do in the sport bike category. But in the adventure riding, the dirt bike category, where would you enter a bike as big as the R80 GS?
Yeah. And in 1985, this man won the Paris-Dakar Rally on an R80 GS. And BMW said, okay, we're going to produce these now for the public. So they produced 250 of them. And what was special particularly about this R80 GS, which of course we had now seen for 5 years because it came out in 1980, but what was especially particular about this is that gas tank. I have stood next to this bike in Munich, and the bike is huge, and the gas tank is massive. And Gaston was a small guy.
Yep.
So the other thing that this showed was like you can have this bike and you can go and you can ride long distances. You can compete in the Paris-Dakar and not just compete, but finish and win on this bike, no matter who you are.
So as a consequence of that win, which was a big deal for BMW, they came out with a commemorative version. As Louise said, they came out with a 250 count worldwide distribution of this bike. That was the R80 GS Paris-Dakar. And it was the GS with the bigger gas tank, but generally speaking, it was just an R80 with a big gas tank. Now, back then, the adventure market, even despite the win for Dakar, the adventure market for BMW was very, very small. And it even, the rumor is even the 250 that they made of this version, it took them a long time to sell them worldwide. Of course, that wouldn't be a problem now, but back then it was a big deal. And that trend generally continued. You saw a buildup of the GS over a couple decades. And in 2002, we saw this motorcycle, which is the R1150 GS. And what's interesting about this bike is it wasn't even really the adventure, the version with the big gas tank.
Yeah, it wasn't called the Adventure at this point, but it was the 1150 GS, and it was offered in a couple of different setups, one, of course, including the gas tank. What else could you get with this bike?
So if you asked from the factory to have the sort of GS upgrade, you would get the bigger gas tank, you get a shorter first and sixth gear, you get a different seat and rear subframe setup that allowed you to put big burly bags on it, and you got a bigger windscreen. That, generally speaking, was the difference between the two. And again, sales of these were okay worldwide, but they weren't fantastic. But something right around this time changed in a big way to make this bike very, very popular.
Yeah, and it's something that definitely influenced you. It influenced
Certainly
me,
did.
and probably a lot of you know what we are talking about. And that was this series, Long Way Around.
Long Way Around.
If you were here for our 1300 GS presentation, we talked about this because this really, of course, as we all know, put BMW GSs on the map for
Thank you,
a
KTM,
lot of people.
for your contribution to our efforts.
Thank you, KTM.
If you've seen the show, you know what I mean.
For making our bikes popular. But this was a really inspirational series for a lot of people. I know that when I watched this show, I was going to and from work on a little vintage 200. And I was like, that was a really cool show. And I actually said, I'll never do that kind of riding, but that was a really cool show. And then, of course, the next year I found myself riding to Alaska and back. And a few years later, I found myself riding down to the end of South America and back. And a lot of people found themselves inspired that way because this show showed you that you too could get on a GS and ride around the world.
Yeah, you just had to be rich.
Yeah, and have a crew following you.
And then true to form, I mean, set aside the fact that it was dramatized, right? But it was very clear that Ewan McGregor was not a fantastic motorcycle rider at the time. He certainly is now, but at the time, and that's understandable. It was a big bike. It was a new thing at the time, and he was figuring it out, and he really struggled, but he made it. And I found that personally very relatable because I didn't know how to ride a motorcycle off-road. I'd never even ridden a dirt bike before. So the idea that somebody could do this was very inspiring. I want to go to Mongolia. That sounds like a great time.
Yeah, and prior to this show coming out, worldwide, all of the manufacturers who were producing some sort of adventure bike, so a larger dirt bike that could also go on the street, they were selling fewer than 5,000 of them a year worldwide. That's every manufacturer put together selling them. This is absolutely what launched the love affair that the world has now and is still gaining with the adventure motorcycle.
And the line's a little blurry here, but some people would say that this was the first real adventure where you had a completely dedicated platform designed as an adventure with the big gas tank, the upper and lower engine bars, the big windscreen, the luggage mounts, and we saw the GS and the GS Adventure start to split apart as models. Now, the Adventure was always denoted first and foremost by being the bike with the bigger gas tank. So that was the big decision maker for people always then and probably now. Do I need a big gas tank? Do I need to go more than 220 miles? Do I need to get past 300 miles before I get to my destination and can refuel? And that became the adventure-minded person. Certainly for me, this is when I really got into it. This is me in 2015 teaching my daughter to ride from atop of my Adventure and her on her dirt bike. She's now 18. She has her own bike. She doesn't, occasionally she still rides with me.
She won't ride on the back with him anymore.
She will not ride on the back. There's no doubt about that. So this brings us to what most of us consider the most recent iteration, other than the 1300, of the Adventure, is the R1250 GS Adventure, a fantastic motorcycle, a really, really nice platform. Of course, you have a 1250, and you know quite a bit about it.
I do. I have a 1250 standard GS, and of course, the biggest thing that we really saw when we saw this bike come out, yeah, it's a bigger bike, but it had shift cam technology, right? So now we can have that like extra power that we want the moment we want it, while still maintaining our decent gas mileage as long as we're not like wide open on the throttle all the time, like some people.
Whoa.
But,
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
he's right.
I got
from the
185
audience.
pounds to
He
carry.
has more weight to carry. But this bike is a truly fantastic bike. I have my 1250. I love riding this bike. And of course, one of the best things about it is that I can be riding along doing whatever I'm doing, decide I need extra power, roll hard on the throttle, and in 0.6 of a second, I get an instant power kick on that bike, and I can get out of trouble or do whatever it is I need to do really quickly and really easily. But there is a little bit of a downside to this.
And the shift cam technology is great because it is very torquey, it's very fuel efficient, but when you hit the throttle hard and the shift cam flicks over, the bike is no longer fuel efficient. It's very powerful and it's very fun. I call it very American at that point. But man, it goes through the gas fast. So a bike that would normally get 180 to 220 miles to a tank, if you're really hard on the throttle all the time,
Yeah,
the
you
gas
were
mileage
not getting that
drops.
gas
I was getting 120 miles to a tank. And so the Adventure became even more popular still, because now you had the advantage of the shift cam technology, which gave you all that torque and all that power, but also the range. Because so even if you were hard on the throttle, the bike would get you a good long way. And so I personally am a huge fan of the R1250 GS. I still own a 1250. I love that bike. And Louise can vouch for this. I've got a 40-foot shipping container at my house. Half of it is full of motorcycle equipment. Most of that stuff will fit on the 1250. It won't fit on the 13. And because of that, and because of the size of my wallet, I really didn't want to like the 1300. And I use the 1250 for everything. This is a racetrack shot. What I love about this is the guy behind me, his name is Dominic. And Dominic is the product manager for the bike that he's riding. That's an M1000 single R, just a juggernaut of a motorcycle. And we were at the track together when he debuted this bike in the US, and I said, Dominic, do you think you could like get behind me and like kind of stalk me for a photo? The photographer's on turn 4. And he goes, yes, Sean, yes, I will do this for you. But only for turn 4, only for the photo, because I do not want to keep going that slow. And I go, okay. So he captured that shot for me. Now, suffice to say, I love my bike. I'm in sync with my bike. I don't want to like the 1300. I have now ridden the 1300. Of course, you've ridden the 1300. These two
These two
1300s
yeah.
are our bikes. These are the first two to come into the USA. We were the first two to ride them in the USA. And now all of my 1250 stuff is for sale. Because this bike is, I'm just telling you right now, don't ride it. It'll complicate your life. But if you do, you'll love it.
Yeah.
So let us talk a little bit about what makes the 1300 different than the 1250, or the 1300 Adventure different from the 1300 Standard. We're going to start with power.
Yeah, and we introduced the 1300 GS to you guys here at Irv Seaver and then dealerships across the country last year. So this is now a platform that we've seen for about a year here. And if you look at horsepower and torque, these two bikes produce the same amount of power. We've got 145 horsepower and 110 pound-feet of torque. And the reason we're telling you this is important because in the past,
This wasn't always the case.
Yeah.
So it's not uncommon for us, if we go back in time, to look at older Adventure versions of the GS, and they would be a little different in terms of power output. They might have a different different gear ratios in the transmission. They might have a different final drive. These are all factors that were taken into making the bike more manageable based on its weight. And what we found is that as the torque level of the motorcycles has gotten so high and the horsepower has gotten so high, it's really no longer necessary to try to tweak the bike to make one torqueier than the other. The power's there. So the drivetrains on these bikes are exactly identical. Now, one of the other questions that we get very commonly about the Adventure versus the standard 1300 is about the difference in weight. So the weight of the Adventure is 593 pounds wet. The standard GS is 523 pounds wet, so it's a 70-pound difference. I'm going to start, Louise. What is wet weight?
so wet weight, the way BMW weighs and reports weights on bike is it's a curb weight. That means it is fully fueled, all fluids in it, ready to ride. So what we see is a difference in sizes of gas tank, and this is a big start to this. So
Yeah.
our fuel tank is, of course, much larger on the Adventure, which is typical of the Adventure, and that fully fueled weighs considerably more than the fuel tank on the standard GS.
We actually had to look this up because this is basically a 3-gallon difference, 2.9-gallon difference between the 1300 and the 1300 Adventure. And we knew that it wasn't as simple as calculating the weight based on water weight, because water is 8 pounds per gallon, right? But fuel weighs less than water. What I didn't know until we looked it up is that premium fuel weighs more than basic fuel. And so if you put premium fuel on the bike, which you should, the weight is 6.79 pounds per gallon of fuel. So if you take into account the weight of the fuel difference and you take into account the size and weight of the gas tank, you account for about a third of the difference in weight between the 1300 and the 1300 Adventure. That still leaves 2/3 of the weight difference.
Yeah, so what else is it?
How about the engine protection?
Yeah, so engine protection comes standard on the Adventure, which, this is one of the things that we came to find, especially with the 1200s and further on, that was something that we saw, which was standard engine protection on the Adventure, which doesn't necessarily come on the GS itself. However, for most people who ride a GS, whether it's a standard Adventure, standard GS or an Adventure, you're going to put some engine protection on, especially on these big cylinder heads, especially if you're going to do any kind of off-road riding. So if we take that into account, this bike comes standard with these big engine protection bars with a bash plate. So there's extra weight there that the standard GS does not come with.
Now, another difference is in regards to the rear subframe. Now, the standard 1300 GS comes with a forged or a die-cast aluminum rear subframe. It's very lightweight, it's very strong. The Adventure comes with a tubular aluminum rear subframe. And the reason is that they expect that when you ride an Adventure, you're going to use it for more utilitarian purposes, which means you're going to carry a lot more weight. You have bigger side cases carrying more things with a passenger at very long distances. It's an intercontinental touring bike. So as a consequence, they made the rear subframe much stronger to carry more weight. That also makes it a little bit heavier.
One of the things that Rainer Fings, who's the product manager for both this and the 1300 standard GS, talked about was how these two bikes were going to be considerably different from each other. In the past, if we look at the 1200 GS and GS Adventure, the 1250 GS and GS Adventure, they're very similar bikes. One has a bigger gas tank, and one has, of course, engine protection, that sort of thing. But these really went back to being more different. So we had the standard GS that was sportier, so it has that really light rear subframe. That bike is super flickable. We have a great time with that kind of bike on the track. And then this bike is really meant to be your workhorse. Go around the world, put a passenger on it, put a whole bunch of luggage so that you can live off of your bike for 10 months or a year or 3 years. And so it's built more to support that sort of thing.
And notice you said 10 months.
10 months.
10 months. It's how long she spent living off of her bike when she rode to South America. 10 and a half months.
10 and a half months, that's true.
Now, another difference between the two is the wind protection. The Adventure comes standard with much larger windscreen and additional fairing for protection. It also has the extra lights for additional visibility. And that stuff doesn't weigh a lot, but it weighs something, so it certainly does account for the difference in weight. But the last and another really big one is the spoked wheels on the Adventure versus the alloy wheels on a standard GS. Now, spoked wheels have advantages over alloys. One of the disadvantages they have is that they're heavier. They carry a lot more weight. Alloy wheels are very lightweight. They're very easy to maintain. The advantage of spokes is that they're flexible. So when you're riding a motorcycle off-road and you hit something, the spokes will flex to absorb the impact and then flex back to their original shape. Most of the time.
Always? Yeah. I don't think they always
Every
do.
time. I can personally vouch for this.
You should ask Sean about Mongolia sometime if you want to hear about
I hit
spoked wheels.
a rock in Mongolia going like 70 miles an hour in the dirt, and I turned both my wheels into stop signs at the same time. They both lost all their air. They went completely flat, and that is the definition of being in the middle of nowhere when it happens there. Now, one of the benefits to spoke wheels, too, is that the outer rim is made of steel, and the benefit to steel rims is they're quite malleable. So if you do hit it hard enough to bend the rim, it is possible sometimes to bend it back into shape, at least well enough to get you off the mountain. It probably, if you beat it back into shape with a hammer, it's not going to be a usable rim in the long term, but at least it can get you out of a pickle. Now, alloy wheels, by comparison, are not malleable to the extent that a steel rim are. They will bend out, but they won't flex back. And oftentimes, they're quite brittle. They can actually crack. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you can't ride off-road with an alloy wheel. It's quite common to do so. But you have to, as a rider, be more mindful of two things. First of all, tire pressure becomes more important because if you let a little air out of the tire, it becomes a bit of a shock absorber in of itself, and it helps to dissipate the force of impacts into the wheel. The other thing that kills a person when they're riding off-road with alloy wheels, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's people who ride too close to other people, and they ride in the dust of the ride. You know, like when we're riding off road, like you get a little nervous. Like you don't want someone to get so far away from you that you're like, am I gonna miss a turn? So then you start to ride a little closer to someone. When you're riding off road, that means that the person in front of you has kicked up dust, and you've waited until it's settled to down about here, right? So you can see over the dust to your buddy who's up ahead. But what happens is the dust settles to about here, and you can't see what's in the road that you're going to hit. And that's when you hit something, and that's when you might crack a wheel.
Yeah. So what we say, if you're riding in a group, always ride in front. You don't have to worry about
Then
that.
it's not an issue.
Oh, way in the back,
exactly.
yeah. So some of the people that ride in the back of our group, we still haven't seen them. Who knows where they ended up?
Now there is one way actually to make both of these bikes lose a little bit of that weight that is projected up there, and it's actually through the wheels. There is a third set of wheels that is available for these bikes, and they are the forged aluminum wheels.
The Enduro, yeah.
Yeah,
Enduro.
so they're enduro wheels. They're cast and then they're forged, so they're stronger than the original cast alloy wheels. They don't work quite in the same way that a spoked wheel does. So if you're still like riding really super hardcore off-road, probably the spoked wheel is more for you. But the forged wheels are quite strong, and they weigh less. They also function the way the cast or alloy wheel functions on the street. You get a lot of really good feedback in corners, that sort of thing. But of course, their biggest thing is they're about 4 pounds
About
less.
4.5 pounds lighter, yeah, which is a significant amount of unsprung weight. So for street riding performance especially, they're a massive upgrade. And you can ride them off-road. They're almost as strong as spokes. Not quite, but very, very close. Now, we're also going to compare the seat heights between the 1300 and the 1300 Adventure. Now, it's always been the case that the Adventure version of the GS has always been taller than the standard version of the GS. So you can always expect it to be about an inch taller regardless of what suspension height you get and what have you. And true to form, if you were to get the tallest possible GS, that means the tallest suspension with the tallest seat, it would come up to about 35 inches and change, 35.0103 inches. If you got the tallest possible Adventure, which this one is, with the tallest suspension and the tallest seat, it's 36 inches tall. This is a very, very tall bike. I'm 6'4", and my heels float when I sit on this bike. It's very tall. Now, what's very unusual about this bike is how low it gets. And this is something that you can speak to, I think.
Yeah, so I have a 1300 GS that is sitting out there that I ride quite a bit. But then I also have this one, and the most amazing thing that I have found is that this bike, in fact, will now go lower than the standard GS will, which is amazing. The standard GS comes in about 31.5 with its lowest version of the bike and a low seat on it. This one comes in at 31.1 inches in its lowest form of the bike with a low seat on it. So it actually has opened up this bike to a whole world of people who were not actually interested in the bike previous to this, because the GS Adventure was a tall bike. It was always a tall bike. You looked at it, you went, it has a giant gas tank, and it's a super tall bike. So for a lot of people, it was a turnoff. And now, this bike actually fits way, way more people than it ever did before. Now, another difference, we're going to compare between the 1300 and the 1250 Adventure. Again, the 1250 is an amazing platform, and true to form, there's still a few 1250 Adventures left, and BMW has made the incentive so good on them to buy a new one that it's kind of hard to buy a 1300 right now. But that being said, let me talk about what the differences are between the two. And the first is horsepower and torque. Now, the 1300, as we know, comes at 145 horsepower and 110 foot-pounds of torque. The 1250 Adventure is 136 horsepower and 105 foot-pounds of torque. Now, honestly, Louise, you've ridden both. If you just looked at it from the sense of just power and no other feature changes,
do you know notice the difference between the 1250 and the 1300?
Yeah, I would think that if I looked at this just on paper like this, I would be like, oh, okay, 9 more horsepower and 5 more pound-feet of torque. Like, okay. Like, unless I'm like riding really high performance with this bike, am I going to notice that? Probably not. But that's not the case between the two bikes.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah. But of course, they both have the exact same size gas tank between the two. Now, the weight on them is very, very similar. It's 593 pounds for the 1300 Adventure. It's 591 pounds for the 1250 Adventure. So the 1250 is actually lighter than the 1300, which really surprised us, which made us turn to Germany and say, how could it be that this bike is heavier when all of the components are lighter than the 1250?
Yeah, and so what we did was we took a look at these two bikes and we looked at the platform for the 1300 GS and how that changed, and that made the massive difference for this, because what we have is we have a lighter bike, but we have a bike that has a whole lot more standard features than the 1250 did. So there's an entire list of standard features for this bike. And these were all options on the 1250. So if you consider the fact that you get like all of this stuff standard and you're only gaining 2 pounds, it's like, well, that's pretty good. How do we make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, the electronic suspension alone is a big one,
Yeah.
because that does weigh a little bit more, and it's such a huge feature difference. It's like once you have electronic suspension, it's hard to not have it, has been my experience. Now, the big change that you're going to notice when you ride the 1300 is not going to be because of the power, although it is more powerful. It's going to be because of the transmission. And this is a huge change from the 1250. And the reason that it's such a big deal is that on the 1250, and in fact any Boxer Twin you've ever owned or ever ridden, the transmission is mounted behind the block, usually right about here. And for the 1300, for the first time, they've mounted the transmission inside the block, underneath the crank. And the benefit to that is that transmissions are very, very heavy. And when you take all that weight and you slide it down to the bottom of the block and forward, it makes the point of influence on the bike much, much lower. And the result is that this bike is way more flickable than the 1250. So when you start putting this bike into turns, in your mind you say, wow, this bike is way lighter than the 1250. It's not. It's just that the weight has been redistributed to a more efficient location. So as a consequence, when you ride it, it feels much lighter, it feels much easier to manage.
Yeah, so even though you now have all these standard features that were not standard on the 1250, it doesn't feel any heavier. And partially, it's not, because it lost all of the weight, losing that whole bell housing that was around the transmission to begin with. And on top of that, because it's underneath and not bolted to the back, we now actually have a longer swing arm, which provides for more stability on this bike. And it has a completely different ride feel than the 1250 did.
Now, one of the things that makes the Adventure so manageable and sort of also solves a big problem that people with adventure motorcycles have had, which is the whole point of an adventure bike is that it's able to traverse very difficult terrain. And able to do that, it has to have a lot of ground clearance. So when you're riding over a rock garden for example, you need the suspension to be able to compress and bounce around to absorb the impacts, but not so much that the bike itself is slamming into the rock garden on its belly. So as a consequence, ground clearance is very, very important. But if you have a bike with a lot of ground clearance, now you end up with a bike that's very, very tall. And that means that not everybody feels comfortable riding it. Because if you don't have long legs and you try to get on a really tall bike like mine here, then every time you come to a stoplight, well, you have to make an appointment to stop.
So if you look at the two of us, like,
stand up
we
straight for this.
ride the same bikes, we ride the same terrain together, and they don't really build the bikes differently for him and for me. Oh, wait. Actually, now they do. So there's a new feature that was launched, of course, with the 1300 GS last year, and that's adaptive vehicle height control. And that means that this bike, because this is my bike, so this model that has adaptive vehicle height control, when it is stopped or when it is moving slowly and doing slow speed maneuvers, it actually sits lower to the ground than once you get up and get moving. Once you get up to about 30 miles an hour or so, the bike lifts itself up to its full suspension height. So now you have all of that travel, all that ground clearance that you maybe wanted with a standard height bike. But if you were, a little short on inseam length, maybe you didn't feel so comfortable riding a bike like that. Now you don't have to compromise. You don't have to decide, I want a low model bike. Or, even worse, I can't ride that GS because it's too tall. It's not the issue anymore. Whereas now, a really great feature that allows you to be more comfortable, more stable with your feet on the ground when you stop, but then maintain all of the ground clearance that an adventure bike should have for all of those rocky steps and everything that, we like to go out and ride. You don't have to compromise anymore, and that has made this bike super accessible to lots of people.
So just to visualize it, if you imagine this bike with the lowest seat on it, that puts it at 31.1 inches. And once this bike gets moving, it raises up to 32.3. So it's about 1.25 inches, more or less, raise. When you come to a stop, by the time your feet go to touch the ground, it's already lowered again, so it's easier to put your feet down. And they now offer this in 2 different versions. You can either get it very low, like this one is, that raises up to a standard height. Very low.
This is like normal people height bike over here.
Super low. Or you can get another version that starts out at the standard height and raises up to extra tall when it gets moving. And that one would start out with a standard seat at 33 inches and then raise up to 34.3 when it's moving. Or you can get the third version, which is just standard, which is just tall. It doesn't have any adaptive adjustment of any sort. Now, of course, one of the challenges that people with low suspension bikes face is putting it on a center stand. Now, the reason that this is a challenge is that when you want to center stand a bike, if it's a low suspension bike like this one is, then when you go to put the center stand on the ground, the angle of the center stand is quite extreme. And as a consequence of that, when you go to lift it up, you have to lever it much more aggressively to get it off of its center stand. Now, what manufacturers often do is put a shorter center stand on it, but it still is difficult because you also, chances are, if you're riding a shorter bike, you may not have the body mass needed to really pop that center stand up. So with these bikes, they've created a new feature, and the way it works is if I power the bike up, now it's powered up, it's ready to ride. If I center stand it now, the bike will know I'm getting ready to put it on a center stand, and it will lift the bike up the same way it lifts up when it's moving in order to make it easier for me to center stand. So I'm going to put the center stand on the ground, and when I do that, you're going to see the rear of the bike lift up, then you're going to see the front of the bike lift up, and all of that's going to make it easier for me to pop it up. So I put it down, there goes the rear, then the front will pop up, and then watch how easy it is for me to center stand now. It's helping me, exactly. So this technology is actually quite cool. And it's, interestingly enough, it's quite simple, the technology. It's not a super complicated apparatus that makes it work. It's even quite inexpensive. It's like about $650 option for the adaptive ride height, which also has this lifting tech. So this combination makes for a very, very nice system and easy when you're going to maintain it in your garage and what have you.
Yeah, and I have a low 1250 GS, and I mean it's a pain to put up on the center stand if I just want to do it. So like I have a whole little process that I go through with it, which includes like turning on the bike, getting on it, starting it, putting it into the highest suspension mode I can get it in so it raises up, and then like I'm barely on my tiptoes and I turn the bike off, get off the bike, and that helps do that. Well, they have figured out how to just have the bike do that without having to do the entire song and dance. And it turns out like it's pretty simple and it's pretty effective.
It's really nice. Now, when you looked at the bikes up close, and if you've seen them in the showroom, or if you've seen, of course, these ones on the stage, you may have noticed something of interest to you, and that is this little flare that sticks out on the engine bar here. And what a lot of people think is that that is there so that when you're riding your motorcycle, you can stick your leg up here and use it as a highway peg. And the truth is you actually can. It's quite comfortable if you're riding down the road and you do it. Now, that's not what it's for, although it does work for that. The reason that it exists is that when you're riding a motorcycle off-road, chances are you're going to drop the bike. This is a reality of adventure riding on any manufacturer's motorcycle. It's probably going to fall, and you have to be ready to deal with it. And one of the problems with that is that when these bikes fall over, as Louise is going to demonstrate, is they fall over so far they can damage parts of the upper of the bike. So what Louise has done now is lay the bike down, and you see that it actually lays on that little flare of the engine bar. And when it's on that, it's actually quite difficult to make the bike go beyond that point. It doesn't really want to fall further than that. So as a consequence, this helps to ensure that when you drop the bike, it's much less likely that you're going to damage the upper components of the bike when you fall. It is not impossible to damage them. I can tell you there is a combination of fall circumstances where you can still hit the upper tank and the handguard, and I can personally attest to its ability to do that. In fact, I'll tell you a story. Like some of you have ridden some of the new BMWs, even the new GSs, have a feature on the display that you can turn on called the Sport Display. Has anybody seen that before? If you haven't seen it,
And the Adventure has this screen, and we can show it to you later. It's pretty great.
It's a very, I think, nobody but me thinks it was a bad idea to put this on a bike. Everybody loves it but me.
It's a brilliant idea.
It's a terrible
super
idea.
Awesome.
And the reason that I think that it's a terrible idea is that the bike will tell you what your lean angle is in real time. So as you've got the bike pitched into a turn, you can stop looking at the road and look down to see what your lean angle is, which I think is an awful idea. And what's worse is that any lean angle you achieve, it always records your highest score. So it tells you what your best lean angle has been on the ride, and it compares it against your current. So you're constantly trying to outdo yourself.
And if you're like riding with your friend on twisty roads and you're on calm together, you can be like, I got to 33 degrees on that. And you can try and make your friend beat you.
And this happens to me. I was riding with a friend of mine, and he rode my Adventure. And then I went to hop on the bike, and the first thing I did was check to see what his lean angle was. And to the right on his motorcycle, he had reached about 36 degrees on my bike. And I went, well, 36. I mean, for somebody that doesn't know my bike as well as I do, that's pretty good. I could beat that, though. On the other, to the left lean, he had reached 68-degree lean angle. And I go, how in the hell did you get to 68? You crashed my motorcycle. He dropped the bike on the side, and the bike recorded it as a lean.
In case you guys are wondering, that's what 68 degrees looks like right there.
But all joking aside, this is a critical part of adventure riding. When a motorcycle falls, they fall oftentimes very, very far. And I don't care what the manufacturer is, and I don't care what the size of the motorcycle is. When they fall very, very flat. And regardless of whether it's a dirt bike or a big adventure bike, when they fall down flat, they are very, very hard to pick up. And this is a big fear for people, because you're asking yourself, if I'm out riding this bike on my own and it falls, will I be able to pick it up on my own? I don't know that I can. And this is something I've always loved about the Boxer Twin versions of the GS, is they sort of have this built-in tip-over point where the bike doesn't want to fall beyond the engine block. That's certainly true of this bike. So if you understand the right technique, it's relatively easy to pick up, and I'll show you. So what I do when I want to pick this bike up is I sit on the seat. We call this the back end technique. Louise and I both teach off-road technique, and this is one of the first things we teach people how to do. And I grab 2 points on the motorcycle. The hand grip is always one here, and then something else that's hard mounted to the bike. In this case, I've got this very convenient rack here. Now, the key to this lift is how much I bend my knees. I don't want to be really low or my knees are beyond 90 degrees. If I'm too low, I don't have any lifting leverage in my legs. And I don't want to be too high either, because then my feet are going to slip. And I'm going to run out of bend in my knees before I get the bike all the way up. So what I look for is about a 90-degree bend. So I'm at about 90 degrees. I look up so my back is straight, and I just stand up and walk backward. And hopefully I've got my side stand down. And if I don't, then I toss the bike over the other way and I start over. But I have found when Louise and I teach off-road riding, and we'll show them how to do this on our bikes, and then we invite people over to come and lift up our bike so they can see. And this is where the light bulb goes off, and people go, I think I can actually do this even with a big bike. If you can lift it up, then you can ride it. I think we can all agree to that. It's a nice thing to know.
That is a nice thing to know. That allows most people, once they learn that part, to like look up a road that they haven't been on before, and if it's maybe not paved and they were always a little sketchy about it, they might look up there and go, okay, I know I can get myself out of trouble if I get myself into trouble, so now I'm going to give it a shot. And it just opens up like the world of where you can go on a motorcycle when you know that you can do that.
Now, if you've come up and looked at this bike closely, not this one, but this bike closely, you may have noticed that it is missing a critical component that is needed for motorcycle riding. Does anybody point that out, what that was?
Did you see what this bike is missing?
It's
It's the hatchet.
yeah, it's missing the hatchet, yeah.
Missing the hatchet.
The bike is missing a clutch lever. And that's because this bike has a new feature that's new for the adventure.
Yeah, so this bike has what is called automatic shift assistant, and it doesn't have a clutch. So how does it work? Well, the great thing about this bike, you'll notice it does still have a gear shifter, so you can still shift the gears, but it has two different modes that you can ride it in. One is manual, and one is called drive. When you turn the bike on and you start it, the bike automatically starts in manual mode, which means you are going to shift the bike similarly to how you would if you had Shift Assist Pro. So if you have a bike that has Shift Assist or Shift Assist Pro, you know that you use your clutch to get going, but once you get going, then you just use your foot to shift up through the gears while you're accelerating, and you use your foot to shift down through the gears while decelerating, and you do it all without using your clutch. So this is very similar, except that you don't need your clutch even in first gear to get yourself going. However, you do shift when you're ready to shift up. You shift down when you're ready to shift down. And that's how you operate it in the manual mode. Now, if you want to try something different, you put it into drive mode.
And you can see the button right here. It's on the left grip. It has
Yeah,
a drive and a manual.
It has a little D and a little M on it, okay? And once you get the bike put into first gear, you can switch from D to M. You can shift anytime. You can do it on the fly while you're riding. You can do it while you're stopped. When you put it into drive, it functions more like an automatic car. So you're only using your throttle opening and closing, and the bike will shift for you. And you're using your brake, rolling off the throttle and using your brake, and the bike will downshift for you. Now, one of the things that we have found, because we got this and we didn't know how this, technology was going to work and what we were going to think of it. And we're like, okay, so like how does this work? How do we feel about it? In the end, even when you're in drive mode, if you don't like the gear that you're in, you can shift using the gear shifter at any time. They've left you the gear shifter. You always have the control of putting that bike in whatever gear it is that you want to be in. Now, do you need to do that? Not necessarily. The way the bike works with its shifting depends on a number of factors. One is how you are riding. Are you just out for a leisurely ride and slowly opening and closing your throttle? Are you out to do some performance riding where you're riding hard and opening the throttle hard and dumping it and asking for engine braking and asking for hard acceleration? And then it also depends on what ride mode you're riding in, and it depends on your lean angle. So there's no simple pattern for how this shifts. And in fact, you want to talk about how this works when you're just tooling around.
Yeah, so you imagine for a moment, you've got the bike in automatic mode or drive mode, and you're just on a casual ride. And when I say casual, we're just weaving along nice and easy. We're being really light on the throttle, 10, 15% throttle opening. And what we're going to do is show you a TFT display here. This is Louise riding at a casual pace. And what I want you to notice is when the bike shifts, when she's casually riding and just a little open on the throttle. So she's now getting going from a stop. She gets rolling. The bike gets up to 3,000 RPM and shifts. 3,500 RPM shift, now it's in third gear. 3,500 again and shifts, fourth gear.
And this is optimizing your gas mileage for you. It's saying, all right, you're not out here trying to like do really hardcore performance riding. So it's shifting sooner. It shifts very smoothly. So you have really nice gas mileage. And if you're riding with a passenger behind you, you don't get beaked in the back of the helmet with that shift.
Now we're going to look at the same thing, but this time we're going to be much more aggressive with the throttle. So we're going to roll on the throttle really hard, and I want you to notice where the RPMs get to before the bike shifts under hard acceleration. So now Louise is taking off hard and fast. She gets up to almost 6,000 RPM, shifts, 7,000 and shifts, 8,000 and shifts, coming up now to 8,500 in shifts. And now, of course, Louise, you were a professional rider on a closed course during this time,
Indeed. Yeah.
right?
On a cold day, apparently, I had both my seat heater and my grips on.
Yeah,
at
it's
3.
55 degrees out.
Like level nuclear on both
Yeah.
of those.
Any similarity to a Kentucky back road is completely coincidental. Now, so what you're going to find when you try it is when you put it in manual, it's going to, like Louise said, it's going to shift like you're used to shifting. You just upshift, you downshift, the bike will shift when you ask it to. When you put it in drive mode, it will shift when it decides to. But that doesn't mean you can't shift even in drive. If you find yourself in a situation where you want to shift, or you accidentally shift because you're just accustomed to, you can still shift even in the automatic mode. But the bike will always revert back to automatic. So even if I downshift a couple times because I want to pass a car, the bike will upshift when it deems necessary if I'm in drive mode. Now, it could be that you want to switch to manual mode. And in that instance, you can switch back and forth between the two anytime you want. You can be riding down the road and just hit the button and it flicks over. You can switch several times in a given minute if you want to. The bike will allow for this. It's a very interesting way of riding. I was actually surprised by how quickly we got used to it.
Yeah, I certainly got used to it quickly. I've been gone for the last month and a half out of the country, and so I came back and I got on this bike last night to ride it. I'm like, oh, wait, I have to remember how to ride this thing now. I'm like, oh yeah, actually, it's really easy to do. It's really intuitive. I'm not gonna say that it knows how you ride and it rides the way you like to, but it almost feels that way sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool.
Good stuff. Now, another bit of technology on this motorcycle is the sort of utilitarian nature of the bike. Now, the guy that designed this, we've mentioned his name a couple times. His name is Rainer Fings, and Rainer has been around the GS for a very long time. He developed the 2005 R1200 GS, what we often internally refer to as a hex head GS. He developed the HP2 Enduro. It's a very popular cult classic sort of motorcycle. The first liquid-cooled GS, the 1250, and now the 1300 and 1300 Adventure. This is probably his last bike before he retires, as far as we know. He sort of like gave us this like, maybe there's another bike coming under his name, but he wouldn't say it for sure.
And Rainer he's a super cool guy. He is a dude who is absolutely passionate about big
He's hardcore,
GSs.
man.
Hardcore.
Yeah, and what's so funny about him is, and I don't think he realizes how influenced he is by Americans. And what really stuck out to us is we were looking at some of his AutoCAD drawings from the 1300 and how there's a freaking Starbucks cup in the design. And we had asked him, because this black one here has got this rubber platform on the top here, and we asked him, what is this for? Why is this here?
It's kind of grippy. It's like, okay.
And he says to us, this is so when you're parked, you can put things here and they won't fall off. And when he told us that, he actually made the shape of a Starbucks cup, setting it down on the, and I don't think that he knows that it's not actually a compliment when people say you only take your GS to Starbucks. Like, he thinks that's something we really do. And I don't honestly see the problem with that. I happen to love my 7-pump chai after a good hardcore adventure ride down the highway.
Yes, you do like your coffee-flavored candy. But we definitely, both of us will go to Starbucks, but we will usually go with a really dirty GS.
So what you're going to find when you look closely at the Adventure is there's lots of mounting points on the motorcycle. For example, on the tank, there's a big mount point on the tank itself. There's 2 smaller mount points up top of the tank. And that is designed primarily so that when he puts a tank bag on, he's developed a tank bag specifically that clips into these 3 points, so you don't have to use straps. But he designed it in such a way to where if you don't want to use a tank bag, you can use those mounting points for other things. What that is up to you. And this really lends to the sort of mindset of him paying attention to Americans. Because more than any other country, I find that Americans really like to mount things to the outside of their motorcycles.
And Americans really like to take all of the things with them when they pack up to go for a weekend of camping or go out on a BDR for a week with friends. Like I have seen some stuff strapped to motorcycles, and people will take a lot of things with them for their creature comforts.
And true to form, for me, as I've started to claim and make this bike my own, I put my tow strap here so that if anybody runs out of gas, I can give them a quick lesson on how to do a bike-to-bike tow, and I can tow them. And I always have that mounted to the outside of my bike, so even if I don't have my side cases, I can tow. I've also got a hatchet that's mounted to the side of my bike. Now, what do I use that for? Well, the truth is I've never actually used it, but it looks so freaking cool. It really does. And people see that and go, wow, man, must be a real adventure rider.
He aspires to use it.
One of these days. Now, I've had to use a hatchet on the trail before. It's just never been my hatchet. It's always I'm riding somebody else's bike when it happens. I've never actually had to use mine. But the night is young. Who knows what's going to come before us?
Yeah, and in fact, if you were to damage your spoked wheels off-road and you need to beat that back into submission, you can use the backside of that hatchet.
So the great thing about this is that the mounts where I have mounted my hatchet, they actually make a bag that mounts on here that you can stow things in. But if you don't want the bag, the mounts are designed in such a way to where you can put other things on it. And as you look around the bike, you're going to see different mounting points like that throughout the bike. Like, for example, the passenger seat, there's a bar that you'll see on the front of the passenger seat. And what the heck is that for?
Yeah, well, I can tell you what I would have used that for when I rode down to the end of South America and back. I was told don't buy tires in Ecuador because it's really expensive to buy anything not made in Ecuador. So just avoid buying things there. And so I said, well, my rear tire is getting, I think I'm going to need a new rear tire in Ecuador. Okay, I'll buy one in Colombia before I get there, and then I'll have it with me. So, of course, I buy a rear tire in Colombia. As it turns out, my rear tire lasted 4 more countries until I got to Chile. So I actually rode around with a rear tire strapped to the back of my bike. Around the world motorcyclists, you always see pictures of them with tires strapped on their bikes. Well, that was me. I was doing it, riding around with a stupid rear tire strapped to my bike. That mounting point would have been really convenient for me on my bike.
Really nice. So to use luggage, for example, so these are the new aluminum side cases that mount on the bike. And when you put them on, they go on really quick and easy. I've never done it when I was holding it beside me. But now it's on, it's locked down, and it's ready to go. Now, they make cases like this 2 different ways. You either have a top-loading bag like this one, or you have a front-loading bag. Now, of course, the obvious downside to a front-loading bag is that, or I should say a side-loading, is that when you open it up, you run the danger of everything spilling out all over the place. It's very difficult.
That's never happened to me. Never.
Yeah,
no.
sure. And the top-loading bags are obviously an advantage over that, but there's a major disadvantage to top-loading bags. When I ride a motorcycle on a long trip, I always carry a big waterproof bag on the top of my bike back here. And that bag has all the equipment that I use for camping. It's got my tent, it's got my sleeping bag, it's got my sleeping pad, it's got my leopard print robe. Oh, that's actually a true story. It's got everything I need to be comfortable. And I know that I can take that bag off and I can go for a hike, a couple miles, to where I'm going to tent.
Like you've ever hiked. He does not hike.
I could hike 90 feet to my campsite, and I can set up tent, and I know it's all in there, which is great. The problem with that bag is that once the bag is mounted on the top, I can't get into these bags anymore because the top bag overlaps the side bag. So when I try to open this, I get hung up on it. So now I have to take this bag off every time somebody in our tour gets a flat tire, or I need to get my rain gear, or I need to cook some food, or otherwise get my tools out. I've got to get into these bags, and I have to take this bag off every time. So one of the thoughtful things they did on these is they put this front lever up here, and you see it on the bag. And if I squeeze that lever, I can take the bag off this way, or I can take the bag off this way and get it off the bike so that I can get into this bag without taking off the top bag, which is just a small and thoughtful thing that they've done. And it's an example of what you'll see throughout the motorcycle when you really start paying attention.
Yeah, it seems like, 40 years of making adventure motorcycles has, it's paid off a little bit in looking at feedback from people. I feel like we really are seeing that show up in some of these bikes.
Yeah, it's, if I turned us all into a focus group and I said, what do you want the next adventure to have? Like, I can guess what the top 5 responses would be. Everybody asks for less weight. Everybody asks for more power. Like, this is very, very common. Now, once we get past that stuff, then it starts getting a lot more thoughtful. Like, hey, when I'm riding on long trips, I run into this issue, and I need the bike to be able to manage this, and it's never been able to before. Those are the sort of things that you start seeing guys like Reiner scribble down a bunch of notes and making changes to the bike based on those kind of feature changes. Now, another difference or thing about this bike is some of the electronics. The SOS button is a very, very interesting one. So the thing about the SOS button is that they started coming out with it in the US with the 1300 GS standard. And it is now available on the Adventure and a couple other bikes from BMW. Ultimately, I think we'll see it on all of the bikes in the US. And people ask about what it is and how it works all the time. So I'm going to explain it to you as simply as I can. This is basically the bike's own built-in cell phone. The button has its own microphone in it and its own speaker in it. It has its own cell service. And if I push that button, it dials only one phone number, and that's to the BMW call center, which I think is in Ohio. And it calls that place, and somebody there will ask if you're okay. It is an emergency button. So if, for example, you find yourself in a situation where you're injured, or you see that somebody else is injured, you can push that button and it will call them, and you can tell them, hey, I'm in a bad way, or somebody I know is in a bad way, can you help them out? And the bike can even triangulate your position, and they can send the cavalry to come and help you. Now, if you're in a major accident, say you get, crash out here on the freeway, for example, God forbid, this bike will know it. It doesn't have crash sensors on it per se, but it does have sensors monitoring other things that will happen to know if the bike's been in a major accident. In that situation, that button will call automatically, and it will ask you if you're okay. And if it doesn't hear from you, it will send the cavalry out to come and help you. You can also be riding, like I was riding in Spain, and they'd had this technology on the bikes there for a long time, but I'd never seen it before. And if you drop the bike, just an easy drop, nothing big, you drop the bike and you don't tell it not to within 20 seconds of the drop, it will call. And so if you drop the bike, there's a countdown that comes up on the screen, and you got to know what to do. And I kept forgetting because I wasn't used to that technology. So I was in a sand wash, laying on my side next to my bike, thinking about my life choices. And suddenly my bike starts speaking to me in Spanish. And I go, I'm sorry, I only speak English. And then they change. They go, oh, is this Sean again? I said, yeah. And they said, are you okay? I said, yeah, I'm all right. And they go, okay. And they hang up. This button is a standard feature on the 1300 and 1300 Adventure. There is no cost to you to have it, and there is no subscription fee. It's just part of owning the motorcycle. So the question is, that's the first time I've heard that question.
That's the first time I've heard also, and that's a really good question.
Yeah, so the first question we had is it 24-hour? Yes, it is. It will work 24 hours a day. Now, I do want to point out 3 important caveats to using this button.
I feel like you add to your caveats each time.
I'd like to point out 17 important caveats.
In 6 parts each.
Yeah. So the first caveat, Louise?
The first caveat is, this is not a concierge service. If you get to a town and you're like, where's the best place to eat? This is not the button to push to ask that.
BMW asked us very politely to tell you that. Because if you own a BMW car, the cars have this button, and that button is a concierge service. So you can push that button in the car, and you can ask for a good place to park, or you can tell them about your feelings. They don't care. Like, they're there for you.
On the motorcycles, it is strictly an emergency SOS button, which is why it says a real big SOS on it.
The second caveat that I want to share with you is that this only works where there's cell service. So it will not work if you're off the grid. So if you're way out in the backcountry where you only have, there's no cell service, you have to have some sort of device for communicating via satellite, because this will not. Although, will put a plug out to my new iPhone and the new software upgrade. It will now allow me to satellite text, which was so nice.
Congratulations.
It's free. It's cool. I was able to text and go, Louise, make sure to bring my favorite food from Kentucky, which is bourbon.
But it is important because, part of what we do with GSs and adventures is we head out into the backcountry where there is no cell service.
That's the point.
That's the whole point of it, right? So if you are going to do that, making sure that you have your satellite communicator or some way to get in touch with people is still important. This works wherever there's cell service, which is great. But if you're going in the backcountry, please take an option with you.
The last thing I'll say about it is that if you don't want this service on the bike, some people don't want it. Mostly because for privacy, people don't want the bike to be able to triangulate their position, although we are assured that that will only happen if you push the button. But if you don't want that, you can ask a receiver and they can turn it off. Just understand that they're either turning the entire service on or the entire service off. There's no in between. You can't have some of it work and not others.
And you can't turn it off, one day while you're here and then turn it on. You actually have to take it into the dealership. The nice thing is some people don't want that, but they think, I'm going to ride this for a while until the 1350 GS Adventure comes out. And then, of course, when that happens, I'm going to get the 1350 GS Adventure, and I'm probably going to sell this to someone.
Foreshadowing.
And in that instance, you can have the dealer restore the SOS service for the next owner of the bike.
Yeah. So now that you know that, we'll move on. We've just got a couple more features to show you. So the next element on the bike, if I can make this thing click, is the rider assistance package.
Yeah, and you'll notice on these two bikes, when you look at them, on the front, there's a nice big flat matte black section. There's also one on the back. It seems like the exact place to put your favorite sticker of Irv Seaver motorcycles on there. Don't do that. These are your sensors for the rider assistance. So these sensors allow the bike to know when other vehicles are in your periphery, and they allow you certain benefits. One of them, all of these GS Adventures come with cruise control, but this will give you active cruise control. So you may have seen this on a car that you have or a car that you've rented. You push a button and you set your cruise control. If there is a car that moves in front of you, your bike, in this instance, will back off a little bit and it will pace that car until they move out of your way, and then it will go back up to the speed at which you set it. So the sensors are needed in order to do that, which also allow you front collision warning. If something moves in front of you quickly, the bike will let you know that something is there. It just gives you a little heads up. It gives you a display on the dash. It gives you haptic warnings through the bars. And then there's also lane change warning. So this is something that you may have seen on cars as well. In the mirrors, there are these little triangles that will light up yellow when someone is in your blind spot area. This is really for that time where you decide you're going to change lanes and you put your turn signal on, you look over your shoulder and you're like ready to change lanes, but in that moment somebody moves right into your space. That light will light up and flash and let you know that someone is there. There's a question.
In California, we can lane split.
So,
Is this thing gonna just be going
so
alert the whole time I'm going down the lane?
So the question is about being in California, you're allowed to lane split, is this going to go
Thank
crazy?
you, by the way, for being on the lane split here. I love this so much.
While you're doing that, this technology is all, you can set it to whatever level of sensitivity you want to set it to. If you know that you are commuting and you are going to be doing some lane splitting, and like you're going to do that every day, Monday through Friday, and then on Saturday you're heading out into the mountains, because you can do that on the bike, you can set your sensitivity much lower so that you don't have that going like crazy. There's no warning for the lane change other than a little flashing light in your mirror, but it will flash if someone is there. So you can set that sensitivity lower, and then later when you're gonna go and you're gonna take another trip, you can reset it to a higher level of sensitivity. So it's really adjustable to kind of suit like what your riding needs are. And the biggest thing that's important about this is that this is an option. So you don't have to get any of the rider assistance package. It does all come together as a package, but if this is not something that is for you, you don't even have to get it.
There's an issue that we've known about for a long time, or I should say a statistic we've known for a long time, which is that if you find yourself in an emergency situation, a car stops in front of you, for example, you have a 3-step process that you must go through in order to deal with it. The first step is you must recognize that there's an issue, right? You have to see it. Usually is the reaction of people. The second is you have to come up with a plan of attack. What am I going to do about it? Am I going to hit the brakes? Am I going to maneuver around it? Where am I going to go? That whole process of thought. And then the third and final step is we must now implement that plan of attack. Statistically speaking, we know how long it takes to go from recognizing to planning to implementation. How long do you suppose it takes to go through those 3 steps?
3 seconds, 2 seconds.
3 seconds, 2 seconds? Statistically speaking, it takes a little over 1 second, about 1.25 seconds, to go through that entire process. Now, that varies depending on rider age and rider experience. But that being said, you can expect on average to take that long. Now, the whole point of this technology is to initiate step 1 of that 3-step process. The bike is trying to get your attention so that you see that something's coming. Now, what you'll find is it's calibrated quite well. If you're riding in between cars, it won't necessarily start freaking out on you. The obstacle has to be right in front of you in order for it to really notice. And even then, you can adjust the level of sensitivity that it has. Now, that being said, I haven't actually tried lane splitting on this bike in California, which is funny and ironic because I do live here. We've been traveling all over the country showing it off, and we can't lane split anywhere else in the USA. But I'm going to try it so I can speak about it more intelligently. But when you do test ride it, make sure to do it during rush hour.
Make sure you get some lane splitting in so you can see what that's like.
The reason I asked was because you said it's got the side lane change sensor and it clicks in your mirrors.
Yeah.
And when I'm lane splitting, I don't need to be distracted. I'm looking where I'm heading.
Yeah.
And I'm looking in the rear view mirrors of cars, and I'm looking for that open spot so that if somebody's going to move to the open spot. And you're doing a lot. You're covering the rear brake. You're doing all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't need these little yellow lights going.
I think that what I would want to point out about that is that the lights, I don't find them to be any particular distraction unless I'm looking in my mirrors. So I have to really pay attention to the mirror in order to notice, because it's not a giant, brilliant glare coming at you. It's just kind of a glow. And the only time it flashes at you is when you have a blinker on and there's somebody in your blind spot. So that's the time when you really notice it, when it's and even that flash is not that strong.
Yeah, it's not that strong, and like you said, the flashing only happens if you have a blinker on. It's in that moment where you've looked and you know it's clear and your blinker is on and you go to move, but somebody has moved in it. That's when it flashes at you. What it does is it sort of glows yellow as there is someone on the side of you, just letting you know that it's there. But like I said, you can also completely turn that off if you know that that's something that you are going to be
It's actually
doing.
really easy to get into the...
California uses turn signals anyway.
Yeah, not on BMWs.
Not on
right?
BMWs.
Yeah.
Sorry to berate
No,
Yeah,
it's a fair question.
Yeah, it's actually a great question, especially here in California.
I think that these little, where we start kind of splitting hairs in the technology and how it works, it's really important, because the devil's in the details. How is it that they managed to make this work? They clearly didn't bring the bike to California to lane split with it. The good news is that most countries in the world allow you, especially developing countries, you can ride pretty much wherever you want.
And many countries in Europe, people lane split all the time.
Yeah, so they're able to develop it. I have found a couple situations where I found the early warning system to be a little bit intrusive to the type of riding that I was doing. And I learned I said, there better be a way to adjust this. And so I went in and tweaked, oh yeah, there it is. Okay, early warning, late warning, turn it off entirely. Okay, we're good. As long as I've got that, I'm ready to go. Now, in addition to that, we're going to talk about the 4 variants. The last thing we're going to talk about on the GS, and we're going to take your questions. So one of the issues that we've run into since 1980 when we came out with the GS is that there are so many uses for this bike now, and people buy them for so many different purposes. It's very difficult to make one bike that does it all. And because if there's some characteristics that might make the bike more on-road capable that may make it less off-road capable. So what they've done is created 4 variants of the bike to try to accommodate all of the riders out there. And you're going to find some of them are more on-road oriented, some of them are more off-road oriented. But I do want to point out that all of them will do either. So you can do any one you want. You just find that they might have a bias more for one than the other. So, for example, this bike is their kind of what they consider to be the basic design. It's their half and half bike. It's a half on-road, half off-road in terms of what they expect the GS to be able to do and be used for. This variant of the bike is the one that I have. This is the trophy variant. It has a few characteristics that make it more off-road capable, like radiator guards, for example. It's got more utilitarian. There's more mounts in different places on the bike, so you can strap things to it. Now, I will point out, for example, on Louise's bike, the blinkers on her bike are mounted on the hand guards. And if she turns on the flashers there, you'll be able to see them. So you can see the LED flashers there. This is the standard mount point for the blinkers on all of the Adventures. But as an option, you can also get the blinkers mounted beside the headlight, like you see on my bike. And the reason for that is that if you ride this bike off-road, the chances are you might drop it. And if you drop it, it's probably better off dropping it when you don't have the handguard blinkers. You don't want to break the blinker. So by putting it there, it protects it a little bit more so that it's less likely to have issues. Now you got to power it up first. Now, another variant, of course, is like Louise's, the triple black. And triple black kind of speaks for itself. I mean, the color scheme is just so stunning and beautiful. And then my personal favorite is the Option 719, the Karakoram, which is the most street-oriented version of the bike with the gold wheels and gold matching handlebars and a lot of milled aluminum parts, which would have otherwise been different sorts of metals. So it's a really clean, crisp bike. It's probably more expensive to drop if you ever did. I hope you don't. But it looks really, really good. So you pick the one that you like the most, you equip it the way you like it, and off you go. That being said, we're happy to answer any questions you have about these bikes. Yes, sir?
In the automatic transmission, when you have it in the drive mode for the automatic, you get any engine braking when you shut the throttle off?
Such a great question. So imagine you're riding the motorcycle in automatic mode, the ASA, automatic shift assist in automatic mode, and you roll off the throttle to decelerate. Now, what you'll find on this bike is if you're up in the gears and you roll off the throttle, the bike will have very little engine braking, almost no engine braking. Not coasting, but it will stick at a really low RPM and generally will decelerate very slowly. And the reason for that is that there are times when you might want to roll off the throttle because you're about to go through something that is slick. For example, maybe there's wet leaves on the road or other slick surface, and if you were to get a lot of engine braking in that situation, it might make the bike break traction and get squirrely. Now, in that same situation, if I roll off the throttle and at the same time I reach out and touch my front brake lever and start to pull it in, I don't even have to pull it in far enough to make the brakes activate. Just pull it in a little bit. that will signal to the bike that I would like it to really start slowing down. And once I start pulling that lever, the bike will begin to engine brake. So then it will shift at higher RPMs, and it will start slowing down with the engine as well as the brakes. So once you learn how to utilize that characteristic, you're able to take advantage of engine braking, even in the automatic mode.
And as we mentioned, it depends too on, you know, what ride mode you're riding in. And so we've experimented with these bikes, both on-road and off-road, uphill, downhill, all of that sort of thing, to see, you know, sort of what happens when you roll off the throttle. And, you know, one of the big questions we had from people, especially as off-road instructors, is what happens when you're going downhill in a loose traction environment, you know, like a gravel road or, you know, dirt road, something like that, and you're in first gear, like, do you get any engine braking? Does it keep you? And we have found that it will actually hold you down to 1 to 2 miles an hour once you start to understand how it works and you work with your throttle and your brake. You don't even have to be applying any brake, and it will hold you going downhill in a loose traction environment in Enduro Pro mode at a very, very low rate of speed, making the bike really easy to control in that moment.
Okay, next question. In the automatic transmission, you're in the automatic mode. I've had incidences on my bike where I'm rolling up to a stop, engine dies. Hit the starter button. I can just pull in the clutch lever.
Yeah.
Can you start this thing in automatic mode with it in gear?
Well, we can one up that.
I'm gonna answer this question because the question is, you know, can you start this bike in automatic mode? And the way I'm gonna answer the question is, we haven't figured out how to make the engine die. Because whether you are in drive or manual, this bike will automatically downshift you first when you get that slow, and then it automatically, you can actually feel it, it puts it into neutral.
What I'm getting at, though, is I have been in low gear, and as soon as I pull in the clutch, engine dies.
Yeah.
Now, I'm still rolling, I can hit the starter and get going.
Oh, I see. So,
come to a stop and put
yeah, so can you start the bike if it stalls while you're riding? I guess the answer that we're trying to convey is that this bike won't stall if it's in the automatic. So
The bike drops itself into neutral automatically when you get that slow.
The only way
we have not actually been able to make the bike stall.
the only conceivable way that we can come up with it stalling is if you drop it.
Okay, how about if it's in manual mode?
It won't stall in manual either. You can be in 5th gear in this bike, and you can come to a complete stop without downshifting, and the bike will downshift itself.
In order to keep from stalling. That's the whole point of that.
Yep.
It will put itself all the way down into neutral at a complete stop so that it does not stall. We've tried, and we haven't figured out how to make the bike stall.
Yeah, so the bike, basically what happens is if you're riding and you get down to an RPM that is so low that the bike is now running close to its idle speed, it will shift to the next lower gear. Even in manual. So if I'm in manual and I'm going really, really slow, it will shift even if I don't shift it. If I'm in first gear and I start going so slow that the bike is now down at its idle speed, it will clutch itself rather than stall. So you can't get it to stall is the short of it. We haven't figured out how to yet. I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but I will say that based on the riding that we've done and based on literature we've written, it's not something you can do.
Yeah, and to start the bike, even if you're starting like from cold, all you're doing is pulling in your brake lever and pushing your start button.
Okay.
So should we figure out how to make it stall, my first reaction would be to do exactly that. Just pull in my brake lever a little bit, hit the start button, and
Sometimes you're so slow and you don't have your feet down yet, and so
Yeah.
the light is green, and I've been able
Yeah.
to hit the starter button and continue going without
This is-
having to come to a
This is a game changer for slow races, for sure.
Yeah.
Because you can't stall now. You still put a foot down.
Yeah.
Pay attention, Dave Diaz. You can need all the help you can get on those slow races. So any other questions, I'm happy to answer.
I saw a thing online where somebody was complaining about the side stand side stand with the wrong length or something like that, or can be, or can?
So the question is, I can't speak to all the complaints online, but, because if there's something to be said, somebody will find a way to say it. But I have heard some people tell me that the side stand seemed low for the bike and that it leaned over further than it should. Yeah. The one thing I will say about that is that, like, first of all, you can see how this bike's leaning right now. This has got a stock side stand on it. And you can see, I can take that one off too. They don't seem to lean excessively. That has not been my experience. Now, what I will tell you is that when you get on the bike has an auto leveling system. So when you sit on it, it adjusts its own preload to compensate for the weight of the rider and all of the things the rider is putting on the bike. So this is, back in the day, this was done with a preload crank, yeah? Which nobody really knew how to use because they thought the bike would explode if they messed with it wrong. So most people didn't touch it. But with these bikes, it figures out, it's not judging you. It doesn't care how much you weigh. It just generally, when it measures how much the bike sags when you sit on it and adjusts itself up. Now, if you have a lot of weight on the bike and the system has adjusted itself for that weight, when you climb off the bike after parking it, that setting will stay where it was, and that may make the bike sit a little higher, which means it might lean over further.
This isn't a problem if you're Sean and you're riding your bike and you get off the bike and then you get back on the bike. The problem comes when you're Sean and you're riding Louise's bike and the bike sets itself for Sean and then he turns it off and leaves it and I go to get back on it. So now my preload has adjusted the level on this bike and it's sitting up higher. So when I go to pick it up, it's a little bit harder to pick up. It sits taller, and I can't touch the ground as much as I had been. What happens is as soon as I start the bike, and the bike goes, oh, God, you don't weigh nearly as much as Sean, and it softens, and it goes down.
It doesn't say that.
Sure it doesn't. But then it makes it more appropriate for me. That is one time that I have experienced that after Sean has been riding my bike and probably doing a stoppie on it, something stupid like that.
I don't know what you're talking about. Sure.
Just a footnote on what you were saying about that. So you go up to the bike. Is it when you start the bike that it adjusts, or when you go to that intermediate, like ignition is ready, and then you're?
So the question is, we're talking about preload adjustment, right? So the question is, when is the bike adjusting for your weight? And the answer is it does it twice. So it adjusts first when you first start the bike. So you start the motorcycle up because it needs to be under power in order to adjust the preload. So it does its first adjustment, then it does one more adjustment when you start moving because it knows that you had your feet on the ground, so that it wasn't getting an accurate measure of your weight. So it makes one more small adjustment once the bike starts moving. But it will always do it under power. And you'll notice it. You can sit on the bike and start it up. And if Louise had been sitting on the bike and you're heavier than Louise, you get on it, you'll notice it squishes down a little bit, and then you'll feel it kind of come up a little bit as it adjusts for your weight. When it's running. Not just flicking it on. It has to be running. So the only thing that this bike will adjust when it's not running is the center stand lift. So that lift assist will work with the motor off, but the power on. But that's a different system than the preload. Those are not the same components that are being adjusted. Any other questions? We're happy to answer. All right, folks. Well, yes, sir?
Automatic version is, you have to get it, that's an option, you get it with the bike.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Is the automatic shift assist, do you have to get it or is it an option? It is an option. The designers of this did not figure that this was going to be suddenly the bike that 100% of motorcyclists would want to have. It is purely an option.
And it's a fascinating option. Of course, BMW is not the first person to come out with an automatic bike. And I rode the Ducati or the Honda, the Africa Twin back in 2014 when they first came out with it. And it was a wild experience because there's no clutch and no shifter. the bike just shifted, and you just, like, there was a lot to know about it, and I didn't learn a lot because it was just a test ride, but it was a shock. And when BMW developed their version of it, they refused to take away the shifter, because basically their attitude was, we can live without a clutch when we're riding. With the Shift Assist Pro that a lot of bikes have, you don't use it anyway, but we gotta have the shifter. Like, that's a very emotional part of motorcycling, is being able to shift. So it's just their take on it. If you like it, take it for a test ride, see if you like it. The worst thing that's gonna happen is you have a nice ride on a nice day on a bike that's not for you. You know, then you go ride the version with a clutch, and one out of 5 people are gonna like the clutchless, according to BMW.
Which do you prefer?
Which do I prefer? It depends on what I'm doing. So if I'm riding, there are really two different Sean Thomas riders. There is the rider that I was today with Louise, which we've got comms on, and we're talking and having a good time, but we're also weaving our way through traffic. We're not riding terribly aggressively. That, for me, is 100% automatic shift assist. I really enjoy it. And then there's the version of me that wants to go squid hunting, where I go find somebody with a sport bike and I track them down with my GS and pass them. And that Sean wants performance. And when I want high performance, I want a clutch. So I think, I'm in a unique position where I actually have both. So I think based on the kind of ride, I'm gonna pick which one I want. Which one's right for you? Only a test ride will tell. And luckily, test rides are free.
Yeah, and I think what's important
Sort of.
too, if you do decide to test ride it, like, it needs to be more than just a few blocks of test ride, because it does take a while to get this sort of into your brain of like, okay, how do I really ride this, like maybe in a performance manner? How do I really ride it just in a, easygoing kind of manner? You need to get yourself to a place where you're like, okay, I really do need to hammer on the throttle a little bit and see what this feels like. Rather than just taking a little, tour around the block. That's not really going to get, like all of that in there. And that being said, like, it's sort of, part of our job is we follow all of the dealerships through, social media and everything, because we do work with, most of the dealerships in the country. We get to come out and meet all of you guys and talk to you about bikes. So I'm always, watching what people are doing in social media. And it has been shocking to me to see the number of dealerships where people are coming in and are buying this bike with the automatic shift assist. And I don't think I've even talked to you about this, but the number that I have seen of people who are actually buying it in this was far more than I thought was going to happen this early in the game. But it's like, to a certain extent, it's new technology, and it's really fun to figure out what the new technology does. I'm having a blast riding this. I'm having a really good time with it. Sometimes I ride it in drive, and sometimes I still ride it just in manual so that I can do all of my own shifting, and that feels really familiar to me. But it's interesting to get to know.
Sir, did you have a question? Okay.
So when you take this up Ortega Highway?
Ortega Highway.
That is such a great ride. That's the
Yeah.
one where we filmed all the R18
that's
and then GS
that's a good
stuff
time.
on. Yeah.
That's a good time up there. Yeah, you'd be shocked at how little riding our career in motorcycles allows of actual motorcycle riding. But we do get out. We're on this tour is 46 dealerships around the country, and when that's done, I'm going to sleep for a day and a half, and then we'll go ride. Yeah. Folks, we want to give you a chance to come over and sit on the bikes and touch them and hang out. But before we do that, would you please join me in thanking our friends at Receiver for hosting this, having us out. We appreciate the event venue you come up with here.
Thank you,
Good
Mr.
time.
Bell.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dave Diaz.
And many thanks to the people online that have watched from around the world on YouTube Live. We're glad to have had you. I hope that you enjoyed it. And rock on. Let's go ride motorcycles.
Let's go ride motorcycles.
All right, folks, come on up. Have a seat on the bike, see what they feel like.